My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing The Butler, the 2014 movie about a real-life White House butler who interacted with 8 U.S. presidents from Truman to Reagan.
I'm Cecil Gaines. I'm the new butler.
You hear nothing. You see nothing. You only serve.
You know he got that job himself. The White House called him. He didn't call the White House.
I want to hear all the stories.
I don't know how many stories you're going to hear because they done swore him to some kind of secret code. I'm so proud of you.
Did you go to an all-colored school, Cecil?
I didn't go to school, Mr. President. I grew up on the cotton farm.
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson, who knows when to keep his opinions to himself. Not. Jim, how long do you think you'd last in a job where the people around you were constantly saying things you violently disagreed with?
Well, Gary, I'd love to come up with a funny response to that, but you've actually touched on a serious issue that I grappled with during my career as a speechwriter for politicians and advocacy organizations. It's actually a serious issue. And when I would speak to seminars and college classes, they would say, would you write a speech for somebody you disagreed with or taking a position you disagreed with? And my answer was always that I had to have general agreement with the person that I was writing for. I did not have to agree with every single thing. And technically, I could have written for anybody. I could have written for anyone from radical left to radical right, but I wouldn't do that. And so you raise a serious issue, actually, and sorry I couldn't be funny about it.
Well, my
Did
answer
you ever come up with that?
My answer would be that I could actually last a long time because I did. When I was working in the PR world, most of my colleagues were left-wingers, and I had to listen to them yap all day about their stupid opinions. And so I did last. Yeah, it's a lot more fun when I was working with everyone who completely agreed with me. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Okay, so this movie, Jim, you gave me grief last time for watching movies and spending the whole time trying to figure out who the actors are. You would have gone crazy if you'd been watching with Meg and me. We were not literally 10 seconds into the movie when Meg saw Forest Whitaker and said, "That guy." We spent the whole time trying to figure out who everyone was, because this is filled with a million different people. And there was one famous cameo after another. We tried to make a deal where we tried to make a deal. We're not going to figure out who everyone was. And while the movie was going on, and I was just building up in me. I was always like looking in my phone secretly so that Meg wouldn't see that I was trying to look up a particular actor. So that's a hard break.
I'm going to give you a pass on this one, Gary, because the filmmaker Lee Daniels has said that he deliberately tried to cast as many known names as he could entice or think of to help the marketability of the movie. So it's understandable in this case. Of course, you realize that your knowledge of current and recent pop culture is much deeper than mine. So if I had been sitting there with you and you or Meg had said, "Oh, you know who that is? That's so-and-so," I would have said, "Yeah, who the hell is that?"
Okay. Well, this is the part in the podcast where we usually discuss the president who's been depicted in the movie. But since there are 5 presidents in the movie, I thought we'd rather talk about the queen. And by that, I mean Oprah, who plays the butler's wife. She didn't produce, direct, or write this movie, but I feel like her essential Oprah-ness is all over the film. What do you think of Oprah's impact on American culture?
I never thought about it much, but a few years ago, actually probably 10 years ago, an acquaintance of mine who was a young woman, a Vietnamese refugee, had come to America scrimping and saving to try to establish a new life and saved up. And she said, "I'm finally going to take a trip I really want to do." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "I'm going to go to Chicago and be a member of the studio audience of Oprah's TV show." That was her American dream at the time. So then I realized that this woman had huge crossover appeal. And I think that explains a lot of her influence. She's kind of like a more modern Bill Cosby figure. Of course,
Yeah.
Bill Cosby has fallen into great ill repute, but if you recall what a crossover appeal he had, this to me is something similar. She can appeal to almost everybody and make $1 billion while doing it. All
Yeah,
power to her.
this is something that you and I can't really judge adequately because when she was on TV during the day, we were working, so we missed her during
Right.
prime. And also, we're men, and her show prime is primarily for women who literally idolize her. Yeah, I mean, my sister-in-law just could not get enough of Oprah, and I'm like, what are you talking about? But I think she's been generally a positive force, even though she's skewed central left. She was still a unifying figure. She was not divisive, and also she promoted self-empowerment, which is a very American concept. A little touchy-feely for me, but she's much better than like The View, which largely operates in the cultural space where she used to be. So, I'm glad she's been around.
Yeah, yeah, I have positive feelings about her, but not strong ones.
All right. Well, let's talk about the movie in more detail. So, I'm going to give a summary. It's my turn to do this. So,
Thankfully.
yeah, thankfully is right. This is really two movies about the Black experience in the second half of the 20th century. In the first movie, which is based on the historical record, Forest Whitaker plays a high-end waiter named Cecil Gaines who learns how to please white customers and catches the eye of the guy who's in charge of the domestic servants in the White House. In real life, Cecil Gaines served 8 presidents from Truman to Reagan. In this movie, we see him interacting with 5 of them: Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, Nixon, and Reagan. And for some reason, each of them thinks it's important to confide in him and to seek out his opinion. He's diplomatic, deferential, and popular with everyone except his immediate boss because he keeps asking that the black staff earn as much as the white employees. He eventually gets tired of holding all his feelings in, and then he retires. The second movie is about Gaines's fictional personal life. The movie imagines that he learned to get along and go along and suppress his feelings as a little boy after watching an evil white man rape his mother and kill his father within 5 minutes. He marries Oprah, and they have 2 sons, one of whom is a civil rights organizer and a black zealot who manages to be present at all the major moments of the civil rights era. During the lunch counter protest, the Freedom Rides, the Selma March, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the rise of the Black Panthers, the rise of Black political power, and the protests over South Africa. His second son is happy-go-lucky. He loves his country. He joins the army, and sure enough, he gets killed in Vietnam. Gaines has a fraught relationship with son number 1, but they eventually reconcile and live to see the election of Barack Obama. All right. What did I miss?
I think that's pretty good. I think the two movies concept is right on. And I go even one step further. I think it's almost a civil rights documentary masquerading as a White House insider story and a family soap opera.
Right. Right. Exactly. But no, that's exactly right. I think we need to mention here that it's directed by Lee Daniels, who's a producer, director, and screenwriter. He created and co-produced the TV series Empire, which I never watched, and directed the movie Precious, for which he was nominated for a Best Director Academy Award. And technically, the movie is called Lee Daniels The Butler because it was a 1916 silent movie called The Butler, and Hollywood wanted to make sure no one mixed them up. You have no comment on Lee Daniels, I'm sure.
Oh no, I wasn't really familiar with him.
Yeah.
He has I did note that he had an interesting kind of background and then just got into movies. He owned businesses and stuff
Yeah.
like that. And we've seen that. We're seeing that more and more in Hollywood. I mean,
Well, yeah, he has a great background because as I said, he's not only a director and a screenwriter, but a producer. And you're right, he has multi-talented, and I'm sure he is rich as can be. Interestingly, this movie was written by a white guy named Danny Strong. Does that name ring a bell with you?
well, he's a TV actor, right?
Right?
That's all.
Right.
That's all that rings a bell.
Well, he played Danny Siegel on Mad Men, He was Roger
Okay.
Sterling's wife's talentless cousin who's hired as a copywriter for Don Draper. So
Okay.
very memorable figure.
Points to you.
And he's also been in, you're right, Buffy the Vampire Slayer and the Gilmore Girls. But he also wrote the two Hunger Game movies, and he was also the co-creator and producer of Empire. So
Hmm.
I never knew that a white guy was the co-creator and producer of Empire. So there you go. So the movie had a domestic box office total of 116 million, and it generated another 60 million in international sales. It was the 25th most popular movie of 2013. The most popular that year was Iron Man 3, which had a domestic box office of over 400 million. Rounding out the top five were Hunger Games, Catching Fire, Despicable Me 2, Man of Steel, and Monster University. It was respectfully reviewed, but it was completely shut out at the Oscars, which to me is a surprise, especially in the categories of costume design and makeup. And it's really surprising that Oprah didn't get a nomination either.
So it made good money.
It made good money. It was a big hit. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we'll talk about why we think it made such good money. So, Jim, who would you recommend this movie to, having seen it now?
Well, I'd recommend it to modern history buffs. There's a lot of interesting recounting of the last few decades of American history, the sweep of events that marked the civil rights movement. I recommend it to those that like something of a feel-good ending, and especially to African Americans who might be despairing, a little despairing of what their opportunities will be, to see a movie about struggle that ended with something of what to them was a very positive chapter with the election of the first Black president. I would not recommend it to those who are looking for another Upstairs, Downstairs or another Downton Abbey, because it really is not very complex in terms of getting into the culture of the White House as an institution.
Yeah, you're right. You learn a little bit about what it's like to work at the White House, but not a lot. I would say also, I would recommend this to people who don't know much about the civil rights struggle or the 1960s, but would like to learn a little. Don't want to be stretched too far. And that's probably a pretty big audience. What did you like about the movie?
Well, I was never bored. I was never dull. So it
Yeah,
held my attention throughout. I happen to like movies that intermix real life footage, and events with fictional stories. Oliver Stone does that a lot. I
yeah.
generally like his movies, and I like that it ended on a high note, which it didn't have to, because think of all the places they could have stopped
Right.
the narrative, but they ended it on a high note without cynicism. And I like that it emphasized the role of family and a nuclear family, and showed that the lead protagonist had a strong nuclear family that was nonetheless roiled by the generation gap disputes and rancor of the 60s.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I liked the costumes, the hairstyles, the interior designs, the cars, and everything that showed what it was like to live between 1955 and 1985. I think that was pretty accurate. I like the acting by the black cast. It reminds me of the movie Selma, where the black actors are more nuanced and believable than the white ones. We can't talk about every actor, so I'm just going to run off some of the ones that were in this in case you haven't seen this movie. All-star cast of black actors: Forest Whitaker, Oprah, Daniel Aielloa, Cuba Gooding Jr., Lenny Kravitz, Coleman Domingo, Clarence Williams III, etc. So it was many multiple Academy Awards and Academy Award nominations among the people I just mentioned.
Yeah, I also like that it didn't seem to go out of its way to trash any president,
Yeah,
with the interesting exception of perhaps of LBJ.
yeah, we'll
But
talk about that.
it's I thought it struggled and strained to be fair and not partisan until toward the end, which we'll get into, I thought it sort of went off the rails, and then it just became a democratic lecture. But
Yeah.
in general, I thought the portrayals of all the presidents were not just cardboard cutout figures.
Yeah, I mean, I also think it does a good job of depicting the heroism of the early civil rights activists. And it's a good reminder of how courageous these people were. These most of them were teenagers in the beginning, but then just regular people after that. And anyone who says that we haven't made a lot of progress in 75 years just needs to watch the first hour of this movie. I mean,
Right.
it's always shocking when I see how this era appears on in the movies, because it is, just horrific that something like that was, standard operating procedure in this country down south.
I couldn't even call it a favorite scene because it was so harrowing, but the lunch counter scene
Yeah,
with the humiliation and abuse and food sprayed all over the black young people who were trying to get served and hot coffees thrown in their face
people
and all
spitting
that.
on them. Yeah, it was
Yeah,
terrible.
it's just by regular people,
Yeah,
by
yeah,
women,
right.
not, just Ku Klux Klan gangsters, but otherwise regular people. And it just ate me up. It was terrible.
Yeah. And another thing I appreciated about the movie was that it made a good faith effort to address the conflict within the Black community on how to fight racism and inequality. This is an argument that goes back to W.D. Du Bois, and we had a confrontational approach, and Booker T. Washington, who wanted to work within the system. The truth is, I think you need both. I mean, this is the case within all movements, not just racial ones. In the American Revolution, for example, you had Samuel Adams and John Adams, the Hellraiser and the lawyer. You need someone to be aggressive and scary, and sometimes you need someone to be moderate and compromising. And we see this playing out in this movie.
Yeah, I thought that was done pretty well again until the end, and I'll get to my
Yeah,
views
yeah,
about
yeah,
the
yeah.
ending.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just want to make the point. They even had Martin Luther King
Right,
kind of disagreeing with the radicalized son and saying your father is
right.
doing his part by working hard and doing a job well and being on the inside
Yeah,
and all that. And right before Martin Luther King was assassinated. And what I didn't like is hard to put my finger on. I knew I was being manipulated
yeah,
and exploited throughout the film, but I can't really complain because it's a movie, and from a theatrical experience, it held my interest. But I just thought the way it used the butler as a pawn in order to do a documentary on the civil rights movement was kind of a bait and switch. Sometimes when you're being manipulated and you don't like it, but you still sort of go along for the ride.
yeah,
That would be one of my complaints. And then the other would be some of the points were just too obvious and contrived. The lunch counter scene interspersed with scenes of setting the table at the White House for
right.
a fancy lunch. Yeah, I mean, that was visually interesting, but that's really old hat. The us versus them, the rich versus poor. It's not even necessarily a black versus white thing. Some of the points made were just too damn obvious
Yeah.
and not artful enough.
Well, it was aimed at a broad audience, right? I mean, this is not an art movie at all. I would say one thing that, for me, it strained credibility that the Sun could have been at all the major touch points of the civil rights movement, at Woolworth's, lunch counter, in the Freedom Rider bus rides. They got firebombed in the Martin Luther King room in Memphis. I mean, he was just everywhere. And that was a little, I mean, I get why. I've seen this technique used in other movies, but it just is a little much after a while. And I was a little uncomfortable because I knew a little bit about the Butler going. I mean, because I had read about him before. Of course, his name is not Cecil Gaines. I was a little uncomfortable. The movie took the history of real people and completely invented a Hollywood story for them. If I were the family of that Butler, I wouldn't be happy to see mom portrayed as an adulterous alcoholic, and they, unless they invented a horrible childhood trauma as an explanation for why he was so accommodating to white folks. And he was almost verging on being an Uncle Tom. The truth is that this guy was had a pretty good life. I mean, I've seen interviews with him, and I've actually included some interviews at the end. His name is Eugene Allen, the actual butler, and he had I think he really enjoyed being the butler, and he wasn't tormented by this, I'm suppressing everything and holding it in thing that you get in the movie. So
That's kind of what I mean by it's manipulative
yeah,
movie.
yeah. All right. What do you think the movie's trying to accomplish?
Well, I hate to be a little bit snide,
Yeah,
but it was kind of a love letter to Barack Obama.
yeah.
And I got the sense that the real focus group test audience was in the White House theater room, and how Barack and Michelle would react to it. That was and everyone wanted to be in it for that reason, and et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, that's a little cheap, but I do think that it was trying to show what a great thing it was to elect a Black president after all the struggle of the civil rights movement, without, of course, getting into, well, what did that really do to further improve African American lives in America? I think it also tried to show that despite the horrors of Southern apartheid, that progress can be made in America, and progress was made. And I think it tried to show that the butler was the head of a family, that family life existed in Black America, and a film should portray that and not just be about boys in the hood, so to speak.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I kind of agree with your second point there, in that, I pointed out before about the political movies made during the Obama administration, like same thing happened in Spielberg's Lincoln. They all seem to think that moderate liberalism is winning and the arc of history is bending in their direction. And the movie's trying to show that Black people took control of their own destiny and beat racism. The America at the beginning of the movie has been destroyed and a whole new one has emerged, embodied in the election of Obama. So now, of course, that message is you'd never make a movie like that, because it's common now for people to say there's been no progress and that things are just as bad now as they were then.
Right.
And it's not just civil rights activists that say that, it's women too. I mean, they act like they weren't given the vote or something. It's like, oh, things are just as bad now as they were, 100 years ago. And of course, it's completely ridiculous.
Yeah, I also think there was a message in this movie. Before we watched it, I guess you had seen it before.
No, I never. No, this is my first time.
Okay. We were speculating that, well, it's going to be a lot about civil rights, but maybe it will show a hardworking guy taking care of his family.
Yeah.
We can talk about that too. I think the message in this movie is that being a hardworking guy, doing a job well and taking care of his family is not enough. You had to have a social conscience. You had to get involved beyond your family.
Right.
And they had him doing that toward the end of the film. But they showed that the son, who had gotten involved in politics and gotten radicalized, and then I guess stepped back from the radicalism a couple steps. They showed that, as you said before, that's needed too to bring about change, that it's not enough just to do your job.
Well, it's not enough to do your job, but it's also not enough just to be political all the time,
Right.
and be at the extreme, because they both learn from each other. The father and son learn from each other, and they learn to value each other. So let's talk about the actors, and let's start with the president, since this is a presidential podcast. There are 5 presidents depicted in this movie. And
a couple more in real life, several more in real life.
What do you
Jimmy
mean?
Carter, Gerald Ford,
And Truman,
and
yeah.
Obama were all.
Well, they're not exactly. There were 8 presidents. They only show 5 of them.
No, I'm saying no. He served 8 presidents. They did not show Truman.
Right.
But the real Jimmy Carter and the real Gerald Ford and the real Barack Obama were very briefly in this movie.
Oh, their pictures, you mean? They were shown on TV.
Film and
Yeah.
events. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really talking about the. Okay.
I know, but it's a presidential movie through and through.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So each president gets a few minutes of screen time, and the formula seems to be that we do something good, that we see something good and something bad about each of them, and that each president feels a need to unburden himself to Cecil. A major overall problem, though, is that a lot of these presidents were enormously charismatic, and that charisma doesn't come across. And it's hard to understand how these people that we see in this movie actually got elected president. But let's start with Robin Williams, of all people, playing Eisenhower.
Yeah, my general reaction to all five of the actors is that their mannerisms were better than their physical resemblances. I think most of them had the mannerisms down pretty well, but didn't look like the presidents. However, I thought Robin Williams did pretty well. He spoke in that Eisenhower clipped style of speaking, and he had something of a physical resemblance. I think he was probably my favorite in terms of the acting portrayals. What did you think of him?
I thought that he seemed strangely dithering for a general who launched and planned D-Day. He's not really in command as much as you'd think. There's a lot of anguish, and what do you think, Cecil? and he lets the segregationists push him around until they push him too far. So I thought it was. I think in all these cases they're okay. Some of them are better than others, but I thought he was okay. JFK.
Then,
go ahead.
Yeah, he looked like a little boy, James Marsden. So that just distracted me so much. He was way too young and polished. Okay, JFK was a handsome guy, but he was kind of withered. I mean, he did not have as polished a Hollywood face as this fellow came across. So I just didn't, and I thought the portrayal was unrealistic. I just didn't care for it.
It's funny, we disagree on this one too, because I thought he actually had the best portrayal. I thought, obviously he's a much more diminished actor than JFK was. Again, here's where I'm talking about the charisma. JFK had a lot of charm, and they do a pretty good job here. But we're to believe that the problem that I had mostly was, we're to believe that Cecil somehow became much more emotionally involved with JFK than the other presidents. So much so that Oprah is jealous of the Kennedys and wants to know about her shoes and all that kind of stuff. We do see how sick he was, taking more than 100 pills a day. And they even mention Addison's disease, which is the only thing that JFK and Jane Austen have in common. And he is portrayed as a rich kid who grows to understand the difficulty that Black people have, but not a perfect.
Yeah, I just had some trouble with it. And of course, you have to think back of what we learned later in the film, that it wasn't JFK that ordered equal pay for the Black White House staff.
Right.
It was Ronald Reagan. And
Right.
yet, when you're watching the movie unfold chronologically, which makes sense, of course, you can forget that later on. And then I have to say, I thought that the whole episode of the butler reading a story to little Caroline Kennedy, and she asks about the Freedom Riders bus. It was totally ridiculous. And all I could think about was Jimmy Carter claiming that Amy, his little daughter, said that nuclear war was the biggest thing on her mind as a 8-year-old or however old she was.
Yeah, nuclear proliferation.
That was just such a ridiculously implausible scene that I'm sure never happened.
We got to mention that Minka Kelly, who's famous in our house for once dating Derek Jeter and for being on Friday Night Lights, was Jackie. And
Yes.
but somehow she never changes her outfit after JFK's been shot. She's sitting there in the Oval Office, with not in the Oval Office, but in the residence, still all bloody and everything. So I'm not sure that really happened. And he's the one that has to clean her up. So.
Well, she famously wouldn't change the real Jackie.
I know.
And
because, yeah.
Yeah,
But that was on the plane coming back and getting off the plane. And
right. We don't
I
know
mean,
when she got back to the White House.
yeah. Liev Schreiber is LBJ.
Way too small,
Oh, yeah.
not towering enough. And it just perplexes me how the JFK accent, which is the easiest thing in the world to imitate, how he didn't do it that well. I mean, I just didn't, and I thought the portrayal was probably pretty realistic,
Well, yeah. I mean,
including the sitting on the toilet
right,
and having a staff meeting, which was known to have happened.
right, right.
Um,
But it's a
but
weird thing to include, right? I mean, you got 5 minutes
right,
to sort of summarize this guy, and you see him sitting on the toilet. I mean, you could easily have picked other ways. I also thought that considering that he fought for and got these 2 or 3 or many major civil rights bills passed, he kind of gets short shrift, you know?
right, until the end,
Yeah,
when we're back into a partisan lecture
yeah,
type of thing.
right, right,
But yeah, I thought he was mannerisms were okay, but LBJ is supposed to tower over everybody he's
right,
talking to, and he
right.
just didn't. So
Yeah, I mean, he's probably the least presence in the movie. Now, John Cusack plays Nixon, and not surprisingly, he comes off as the worst, weird and awkward.
but at least he was in the totally made up, I'm sure, scene of when Vice President Nixon goes down to the kitchen to hand out campaign buttons to the African American staff. At least he actually asked them what they're interested in.
Right.
Now maybe it was just fake concern, but that is something Nixon did. And when Nixon later talks about Black capitalism, which was a major theme of his 1968
Right.
campaign, and it's easy for the activists on the other side to belittle that. But Nixon was actually trying to get into material things that could make lives better for minorities.
Yeah, and I did appreciate that they mentioned that. I don't know
Yes,
what they thought about it. If it's like they don't really give it a lot of credence. But I mean, as you know, Republicans believe that the fastest way to advancement is to create opportunities so they could, no longer be dependent on government. And so they gave that a little short shrift too. I mean, John Cusack famously is a liberal who hates Nixon and hates all Republicans. So it's not surprising that he came off weird, but
I thought the mannerisms again were pretty good.
yeah.
The way he talked and walked, and it's just the physical resemblance wasn't great. The most damning thing, I guess, was when they had Cecil overhear a conversation
Yeah.
where we're going to really, get those Black Panther
Yeah.
types, but the Black Panthers weren't good.
Yeah,
So, I
exactly.
mean, now granted, they should have civil rights and not just be,
Knocked off.
shot
Yeah.
down on the streets.
Yeah.
But he wasn't talking about Martin Luther King's group. He was talking about the Black Panthers.
Right. Who were seen as domestic terrorists. Yeah.
Right, and who marched into the California State Capitol in 1967 with assault rifles and
Yeah.
basically took over the hallways of the Capitol. Speaking of insurrections. And, so they were not necessarily a goody two shoes group, but I understand that, they wanted to show Cecil being concerned because his son had joined them. So.
All right. So Alan Rickman, who's probably most famous as Severus Snape in the Harry Potter movies, played Reagan, and Jane Fonda, who's most famous for many other things, played Nancy. He comes across as kindly but out of touch, sort of like that famous Saturday Night Live sketch where Bill Hartman plays him as a doddering old fool in public, but a mastermind in private. Except in this case, he's a doddering old fool in private too.
Yeah, again, I thought his mannerisms were pretty good.
Yeah.
I thought the meeting with Senator Kassenbaum and others was totally unrealistic because Reagan, when they were talking about it, the sanctions against South Africa.
Yeah.
Reagan had his position, which, by the way, was heavily orchestrated and augmented by Margaret Thatcher. He never would have just kept repeating a rote,
Right.
steely-eyed line. He would have schmoozed and come back to the same position.
Well, yeah, they don't even explain that the reason he didn't want sanctions against South Africa is because they were afraid that the communists would take over down there. And that turned out not to happen. But there was a lot of concern in the 80s about communist takeover across all over the world. And it was kind of a weird thing too, how they had Nancy Kassenbaum in there. It's a very specific and odd detail, like Nancy Kassenbaum is in a movie. I mean, who even remembers her?
Well, I know, but they were probably trying to show that he wasn't just a Republican, Reagan. He was an extreme Republican.
Yeah.
And because she was a Republican.
It's funny. By rights, he should be the hero of this movie, though. I mean, he's the one that makes sure that the black and white staff gets paid the same. And Nancy's the one who honors him so extravagantly by inviting him to a White House state dinner. The implication is very strong that it's his stand on South Africa, which causes Cecil finally to snap and quit because he objects to the South Africa thing, which I also think is a very strange issue to bring into this movie because, like, who cares about who even remembers South Africa was an issue,
Well, the other thing is it was a legitimately debated issue.
Yeah.
It's not a slam dunk like whether or not blacks should be able to sit at a lunch counter.
Right.
It's a legitimate strategic debate over is that
Right.
the best approach, and to elevate that, to have that be the reason Cecil quits. He didn't quit because he got refused equal pay. He didn't quit because of LBJ's constant use of the N-word. He quit because of Reagan's choice of a policy on our relations with another country. It was bizarre to elevate that and then to try to turn the invitation to the state dinner into another reason why he quit, because it was so patronizing, supposedly. So that's exactly that point when I thought the movie went off the rails, which I can elaborate on more in a bit.
Yeah, no, he thought exactly. I think that I guess that the movie would have you believe, which of course none of this happened in real life, but the movie would have you believe that Cecil, when he went to the state dinner, recognized that he'd been wearing a mask the whole time, and because he saw his fellow employees putting on their mask, and so he realized that he was wearing a mask, and he was just tired of it. Never happened. Right. Trust me, if everyone who wore a mask at work and acted differently at work than they were in real life decided to quit their job, there'd be no one working anymore.
Well, yeah, that's one of my takeaways from this movie is that I get the idea that, there's kind of a black underclass working at the White House and they weren't treated equally and they had to listen to things maybe they didn't want to hear and things they didn't approve of. I understand the human reactions to that, but it's not just a black-white thing. Everybody puts on different persona in different circumstances. Everybody. Join the crowd.
Yeah, join the crowd, exactly. All right, Forest Whitaker. Now let's talk about we can't go through all the servants, but Forest Whitaker, I thought he was pretty good, incredible as Cecil. What did you think?
I did too. I liked him. I thought he had a lot of nuance in his performance. They aged him pretty well. I thought he was good. I didn't know much about him, but he was able to carry the movie.
He won an Academy Award, by the way, for playing Idi Amin. I don't know if you remember that, but
yeah. No, now I was going to move to Oprah, where we might have our disagreement.
Oh, hold on. Yeah, I have something more to say about him, though.
Okay.
He plays a certain type of man. It's not specifically related to race. He's a working class guy who works really hard and wants his sons to succeed. He kind of overreacts when the son rejects his way of life and then is too proud to walk it back. I mean, welcome to father-son dynamics. I mean, that happens over and over again. We do root for him, though, because he's super confident at his job and very canny at the way he deals with outright racists, and also with clueless people who aren't actually racist but aren't very sensitive either. So I thought, I agree. So yeah, what did you think about Oprah?
I thought it was just okay, not great, certainly not Oscar material, mainly because I thought she chewed the scenery a little too much, and probably unfairly, maybe because she's just too famous.
Yeah.
And so all I could see was Oprah, and I had a hard time getting into her character. But it was just, I don't know, I found her kind of tiresome.
Well, yeah, we do disagree on this. I thought she was pretty good, and I think that she could have had a good acting career if she'd stuck with it. She was actually nominated for a Best Supporting Actress in I
The
should have written
Color
this
Purple,
down.
or was
Color
that,
Purple, yes, The Color
yeah.
Purple. Thank you, Steven Spielberg. That's when, but even before she had her TV show, she was nominated, and so I thought she was good. I'm not sure why they decided to make her an adulteress, unless they wanted to show how she pulled herself out of it, but. And I think she actually did disappear into the role a little bit. I stopped thinking about her as Oprah about halfway through. So,
Mm, yeah.
um,
Again, I have no complaints.
yeah.
It's just I wasn't overly impressed.
Now I'm
Compared
just
to
gonna,
David Oyelowo, which I was impressed. I thought he was good.
yeah. Now he
Well,
plays the
yeah,
son.
yeah.
We saw him previously in Selma, where he played Martin Luther King. And then we also saw him in the movie Lincoln, where he was a soldier who recited the Gettysburg Address. He's actually British, of course. Carries a heavy burden because he has to play so many different kinds of Black archetypes, the freedom rider, the Black Panther, the political operative, the angry, young son. Did you just say you thought he did a good job?
I did. I thought he was very good.
Yeah. Anyone
What do
else
you
you want
think
to call
about
out?
what do you think about Jane Fonda?
Oh, well, Jane Fonda. I thought she was quite good.
So did I. I thought she was good. I thought she was having so much fun.
Yeah.
And
Jane
of
Fonda,
course, there's a
Nancy
reason why
Reagan.
she was good. It's
You
because they
know,
probably channel each other to an
I
extent.
know they got a lot in common. I'll just say one thing though, it was not really perfect. Her Nancy was not perfect because Nancy is actually kind of vulnerable and not as aggressive as Jane Fonda, but she was still good. But they're both actresses, so they're and they're both tough as nails. By the way, I completely forgot to mention that Mariah Carey was his mother who was raped in this thing. And
Oh,
she's someone that I did not recognize at all. It wasn't until the end where I saw her name that I said, "Oh, Mariah Carey's in this movie. That's crazy."
I wouldn't
So,
have recognized her under any
yeah.
circumstance,
All
but
right.
I have heard of her though.
You have heard of Mariah Carey. Okay,
I
good.
have.
All right. Let's talk about the historical act. Well, do you have any other? Oh, you want to talk about Jane
No,
Fonda? So, all right.
no,
Uh,
because
let's talk about the historical accuracy.
well, the key thing to know is that at the beginning it says not that it's based on real events, but that it's inspired by real
Yeah.
events.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a tip off right there that they're going to do more than just um, imagine real life conversations, that it's a fictional movie.
Yeah.
And so I think that we have to, they admitted it, they acknowledged it up
Yeah.
front, and we have to take it for that. But having said that, the lead character, there's so much made up.
Yeah.
He wasn't, his parents weren't raped or
Killed.
murdered.
Yeah.
Yeah, killed. He was from Virginia. He had one son, not two. And the one son was not a radical. He ended up working at the State Department, I think.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it was highly fictionalized in terms
Yeah.
of the
Almost
basic
entirely
story.
fictionalized. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say, but that's also something that is not right is the implication that he never took Gloria to the White House until that state dinner. Truth is that they went to White House Christmas parties. I mean, when you're on the staff, you go to the White House Christmas party and you bring
Yeah.
your or husband or spouse or a guest. Everyone gets to go to those. So, and also he didn't quit because he realized at the state dinner he'd been wearing a mask. He just, according to the Washington Post article on which it's based, he enjoyed himself at that dinner. So that's not right either.
And he was getting up in years too.
Yeah, of course
He was
he's
getting
that
old.
old.
Who
And I
doesn't
gotta
want
tell
to
you,
retire at some point,
and I'm going to encourage everyone to listen to him, the real Eugene Allen at the end, because he's a happy-go-lucky guy. I mean, he tells some funny stories. It's not really the same character portrayed in this movie, but and I think they get things right in the civil rights era. I mean, the depiction of what happens is true in the South, where the bus was bombed, the dogs were sicked on the demonstrators in Selma, Martin Luther King was killed. I mean, all that stuff happened.
Yeah,
I
but I
mean,
think they did try to stack the decks in terms of the before and after,
yeah,
equation in this movie. That's why they had to have the butler whose parents were not raped and killed in the movie.
yeah,
And now I'm sure episodes like that happened. So they
yeah,
didn't just, but they wanted to load up all the horrors on the one end
right.
and then at the back end, make it look like the election of Barack Obama was sort of like the second coming without really getting into, did that make life better for African Americans or not? So I think they accentuated things to try to show the greatest possible contrast without actually falsifying any of it.
Yeah,
I also think that in terms of the social accuracy, that again, this before and after, they left out, for understandable reasons, a huge swatch of African American lives in the northern states
yeah,
who were leading pretty decent family lives. Walter Williams, the late conservative African American commentator, talked often about his upbringing in Philadelphia, how it was a very fun and tranquil time. When it got too hot in their apartment and the projects, they went out to the park as boys to sleep overnight in the city park, where it was cooler and you could do that without getting murdered. So I think, again, this effort to portray everything for Blacks in the worst possible light, again, using things that actually were true for some, it kind of skewed the picture.
well, I thought that I'm not sure I completely agreed with that when they were showing their lives. You had all these married couples, and they seemed to be having a good time, where they had these parties and they were hanging around and enjoying themselves. I thought it looked like a pretty good life.
I agree with that.
And maybe it's a little bit racist, or maybe it's not. I don't know. You can't know these days, but thought that, when Black people get together, they seem to have a better time than we do. They don't have they're not tight asses, and you see this in this movie where they're just they got the music on, they're like making jokes with each other, and it's like no one's feelings are getting hurt, and they're laughing all the time. You show a similar white party, and everyone's like, so worried about their social status that it's like it's not as much fun. So anyway,
At least that's what the movie shows. So
yeah. All right. Favorite scene.
Presidential accuracy. I want to
Oh, okay.
talk
So let's
about.
talk about presidential accuracy.
Yeah, and I'm going to go on so we haven't had a chance to talk about the favorite president of my lifetime, which is Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Right.
And I'm not going to go on a big Ike lecture. I'm only going to simply point out that his record on civil rights was pretty good.
Yeah.
And he wasn't a fancy speechmaker about it. He wasn't a crusader. But if you look at what he actually did, it was pretty good for where the country was at in the 50s. First of all, the federal government didn't even have much jurisdiction over civil rights violations in the states. It was still pretty much a states' rights thing. There was one place it did, and that was in the District of Columbia. And it was Eisenhower that desegregated public facilities, movie theaters, and the like in the District of Columbia, even being hands-on enough to call the owners of the big theater chains into a White House meeting and saying, come on, guys, let's do this. I want your movie theaters in the District of Columbia to be desegregated with no sections for Blacks and no sections for white. He did that, not the heroes, Franklin Roosevelt or Harry Truman. he did that. He supported the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. They submitted a brief when it was under consideration with his Attorney General, Herbert Bronwell, who was a very strong civil rights supporter, saying that he did believe that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. He sent troops to Little Rock to enforce federal ruling, yet most people probably think that Kennedy was the first one to send federal troops to enforce civil rights. He made the first nationwide TV speech on civil rights to explain his decision on Little Rock. Everyone thinks it was JFK that made the first televised speech. And by the way, sending troops to Little Rock, two of those vehemently opposing that decision, LBJ and JFK.
Okay.
So I just think he deserves a little more credit for bringing the country along, not as fast as a lot of people, including us, would have liked, but he did do a lot more than he was given credit for.
So we will have to find a movie somewhere along the line here where Ike is the main president or the only president that's mentioned, because you're right, he's a very important figure in our lives and also in American history. So we'll keep an eye out for that, and you can give us another little
Go on and on more.
You can go, yes, exactly. I have a feeling you're not talked out about Ike yet.
I am not talked out, and probably, there are movies about D-Day, of course.
Yeah.
We could someday use one of those as an excuse.
Yeah.
But it would be better to find a real presidential.
Yeah, no, I mean, trust me,
argument.
I've been on the lookout because I know you wanted to talk about Ike. Okay.
I wish he could run again.
He's almost old enough.
Right.
Okay. Favorite scenes. What do we got for favorite scenes?
I like the train station scene when the family, Cecil's family, was bringing the son to send away to college, because that's not a black or white scene. That's such an Americana scene. That's a Norman Rockwell scene, the first generation to go to college. That's been replayed all over America mid-century. And I just liked it for that.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, we've kind of talked about this before, that one of the reasons this movie was so popular, I think, is because it showed that, the black family experience is very similar to the white family experience. I mean, we all go through the same things with, relating to our kids and with wives and husbands and stuff and our friends. So I think you're right about that. I would say my favorite scene is when Nancy Reagan invites Cecil to the state dinner. So it's a little emotional because he's getting the recognition he deserves after all these years.
Yeah, I like that. And I like a couple more on our theme of this could apply to all families. I thought the scene of the military knocking on Cecil's door, and Cecil immediately knew why they were there. Again, replayed over and over.
Well, the reason they were knocking on the door is because his son had died.
In Vietnam, and a son that didn't exist in real life, which I don't.
Yeah, well,
we might have forgotten to point out. But again, that scene was very effective, and it's not racially specific. As well, and I'd imagine the family dinner table scene showing the intense generation gap between the older father and mother, and then the radicalized son bringing a radical girlfriend home. And it starts with small talk and ends in a rancorous fight and kicking them out of the house. Again, I thought that was well done. And again, replayed in a number of families during the 60s.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention that as my second favorite scene. What a crazy afro that girlfriend had, right?
Right.
I mean, how could they have kept their hair so, like a giant globe or something? But anyway, I would say, all the scenes showing the Freedom Riders and the lunch counter confrontation, not really my favorite scenes, but they were very effective because they continue to shock the conscience. So those were very impactful.
The lunch counter scene stands out to me.
So there's another scene that people can relate to, I think. So in the first decade that Cecil had the job, he was really buttoned up and he wouldn't tell his wife anything about what it was like going in the White House. And she feels all shut out. Finally, about 10 years in, he loosens up a bit. And there's a scene when they're in a bed and he tells her about the first lady's shoes and they're just kind of talking and giggling and that really felt like a major turning point in their relationship. And also it felt very familiar to husbands and wives, like sharing things, pillow talk, literal,
Right,
literal pillow talk.
right. And you know it's going to happen no matter whether they're told that they should never talk about it
Yeah.
outside. You know,
Yeah.
it's always going to happen.
You got anything else?
Not on
Favorite
scene.
lines? Let's do favorite
Yeah,
lines.
I like there was one early on where it said someone said to Cecil, "We've got two faces, one for ourselves and one for the white man."
Yeah,
And I like that line because again, that could apply beyond the African American community.
right. Well, I liked it when when he goes in for the interview and his boss to be says, "Are you political, Mr. Gaines?" And he says, "No, sir." And the boss says, "Good. We have no tolerance for politics at the White House."
That was one of mine too because it's hilarious. Because there's no politics in the White House. Every single thing in the White House is politics. I just thought that was funny as well as,
Yeah, yeah.
showing how arrogant that guy was. I
What
like
else?
the line. I
Yeah,
like the line where a crowd of the blacks are watching LBJ on
yeah.
TV, and LBJ is talking, and then one guy says, "Since when did he start calling us Negroes?" Because of course
Oh,
it shows him using the N word.
right,
Otherwise,
right,
I
right.
just that was, and of course
Um,
we have to love the oft quoted and line at the very end where he says, "I know the way."
oh, right, right,
When an aged Cecil is being led into the White House to meet Barack Obama, and the usher says, "Let me show you the way," and Cecil says, "I know the way."
right, right. The scene that you
By the way,
mentioned,
let me just ask you, did you ever find out if did Cecil get to meet Obama? I never
uh,
saw if that really happened or not.
I don't think it did.
Yeah,
Everything that I said found said that it was unclear whether he did, and which I assume means that he didn't.
right.
I thought, that scene where Oprah kicks the son and his girlfriend out, and she slaps him and says, "Everything you are and everything you have is because of that butler." And in a similar line, that when Martin Luther King tells the son, when he kind of is embarrassed when he admits that his father was a butler, he says, "Young brother, the black domestic helps defy racial stereotypes by being hardworking and trustworthy. He slowly tears down racial hatred with his example of a strong work ethic and dignified character. Now, when we perceive the butler or the maid to be subservient in many ways, they are subversive without even knowing it."
Yeah,
Uh,
I thought that was really good.
yeah, and it goes to the point that a lot of this movie is about work ethic and the idea of just showing up and doing your job well, which, is a conservative theme.
But in the final analysis, that's not enough. The movie is also saying,
Right,
you
right.
know, and and they never do point out that true racist segregation, you would not even have black workers in the White House. In other words, if it was truly, a racist, you
Well, I will say this. If when you actually did research to see whether Reagan was the one that equalized the pay, and it didn't. I couldn't find any verification of that. But all the stories made a big point of saying that when the White House was first staffed, it was staffed by slaves. So, you
yeah.
know, I think there probably were always black people working there.
And I know there's always talk that the slaves built the White House as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah. I got one other quote. As you know, Oprah was having an affair with her neighbor. His name is Howard. And at one point, A third neighbor says, "Hey, Gloria, did you hear about your neighbor Howard? A guy down on 57th Street caught him in bed with his wife, shot him dead, shot him in the back." And Cecil, who's never said anything about anything, says, "I don't know, maybe he got what he deserved." You know, maybe he knew more than he was letting on. Relevance or comparisons to politics and society today, are there any?
Well, race is always relevant, probably more than it should be, but it is. And the question of how to deal with it is very relevant. We may not be as racist a country or a racist country as such, but we surely are a racialist country, meaning so many people seeing everything through a racial and identity lens. And so any movie that speaks to that, I think, is going to be relevant. And it just sort of, to me, it brings up the question of no matter how much progress we make, will we ever get to the point where race really doesn't matter? In other words, where we can get to a colorblind kind of ideal.
Right.
And I know that's a big debate in society. Some people feel that it's racist itself to say that we should try to be colorblind. But I still harken back to the Martin Luther King days where you try to make it not about the color of people's skin. But today, I think so many Americans and institutions want to make everything about race and about identity. And I personally think that's too bad.
The other thing that is always relevant is this whole issue about something we've talked about here already, this whole issue about how do you make progress by being radical and scary or trying to persuade. This is something that occurs in all, as I said, in all movements. Women's movement had its moderates and its radicals, and so this is an ongoing discussion about how you make progress.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Could the movie be made today?
Not only could be, it probably will be sometime after January 20th, 2025, and maybe with a chapter or so added on George Floyd and BLM, ending with a feel-good ending. So yes.
Okay. Well, we'll get back to you on whether your political prognostications are as good as you think they are.
Wait, I want to hear, do you think it could be made today?
I do not think so. I think it's out of step with Hollywood's woke sensibility. It's too moderate and it's too even-handed. Doesn't take a stand on who the good guys and bad guys are between the Republicans and Democrats. There was recently a front page story in the New York Times about Hollywood's backing away from putting messages in movies because Twisters doesn't specifically mention climate change. So maybe the pendulum is swinging back to the middle of the road, but we're not there yet. So I don't think it could be made today. If you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
Yes, I actually would. I think it contains enough solid review of the major events of the civil rights movement. It doesn't go overboard on creating cardboard cutout villains in a partisan sense, heroes and villains, except toward the end. And so there's a couple scenes that are a little too intense and that give me pause. But generally speaking, yes.
Yeah, I think actually it'd be quite a good movie to show a high school current events class or a history class. As I said, it's a movie that sort of lightly touches on some of the high points of the civil rights era and introduces you to some of the presidents. So I would definitely show it. What would you grade the movie?
Well, I'm going to give it a B on two criteria. A B is a movie going experience. I thought it's a decent movie, and a B because it's a B movie. In other words, to me, it's a classic B movie. Nothing hugely artistic, pretty predictable, pretty contrived, and I like a good B movie usually from the 50s, usually true crime or something like that. But it's a B movie to me, and I'd recommend it.
I would recommend it to people myself, and I actually put it as a B as well. I mean, it's trying to reach a broad audience, and it did. I mean, it made a lot of money, and I'm sure it appealed to black and white audiences. So I thought it was a B. All right, we reached the end of another exciting podcast here. I'm going to encourage everyone to stick around at the end for a few short stories from Eugene Allen, who is the actual butler in this movie. Compare and contrast the way he is in real life versus the way he's portrayed in the movie. I also want to say that the podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most podcast platforms. So please go there and subscribe. And Jim, do you have any final thoughts? Anything else you want to say?
Well, just to invoke the Martin Luther King quote that appeared on screen at the very beginning, darkness cannot drive out darkness. I think those are good words to remember in our politics, in our society, our trying to figure out what to do about race and segregation and such. And so that's what I would conclude on. Darkness cannot drive out darkness.
Well, he was a minister, so I'll say amen. See you next time.
Goodbye.
We had a houseman at the White House named George Thompson, and President Truman used to come over at lunchtime and have lunch, and he had an office and a desk in the Oval Room on the second floor where he would go and do some work. So he'd work in there a while, and then he'd go back to the office. So he finished his work, and President Truman went to the office. George goes in to tidy up the room and see if everything was in place. And when he didn't see too much to do, he got everything in shape. President Truman had a large leather chair, which he was very comfortable. George would sit down in it and ride back. He was president. As soon as he got comfortable, who walks back in but President Truman? He looked at George and said, George, you're in a mighty hot seat. He picked up his papers and went on back to the office. That was the end of that. Because I've seen the time that certain things we'd done in one administration, and boy, they thought it was wrong. We shouldn't ever do it. And another administration would come in, and it was perfectly all right. For, say, the Eisenhower administration, when we had state dinners or any dinner, Ms. Eisenhower forbid us to pick up plates until everybody was through eating. Mm-hmm. And she would sit there and look. And if we did, she would tell us about it. Mm-hmm. And so we learned, and we decided we would not pick up a plate until everybody was through. So then the next administration come in, and sometime they would want to rush things. I can recall once that President Johnson told me, he says, why don't you pick up? I said, Mr. President, your guests haven't finished eating. And he said, well, if you start picking up, they'll rush and get through. One thing about being at the White House, you do it for so long. Most people who work there for many years, and you see each other every day. You cross the path one way or another, you're helping one another, and you're really one big family. If I had to do it all over again, I think I'd do the same thing, because after all, there were many things that I saw or never would have seen in life, or people I saw. Like you say, I've seen probably every leader in the world, kings, queens, prime ministers. You know, you enjoy those things. I was loyal to the White House. I loved it. I want to make sure that the president and the first lady were happy, the guests were happy. And after so many years, it was just a part of me.